Okay. Very good. And I am going to introduce Ellen Haspel, who's listed as Beth David because that's how she logged in. And she's going to say a few words of welcome to everybody tonight.
Okay. Welcome everybody tonight. As the president of Beth David Women, we're co-sponsoring this evening, and I want to welcome everybody. And I would like to introduce a man who now needs no more introductions because I think we know who you are. Anyways, I'm very, very, very interested, as always, to hear what you have to say for this evening. This evening's talk, Righteous Gentiles, Appreciation of the Non-Jew. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this, so I will let you speak. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's Avrum's turn.
Yes, it is Avrum's turn.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here once again for the third installment of the Shiurim, the classes that I'm giving for Beth David. And of course, it's always a pleasure to be here. I feel that Beth David is a home of mine, or at least one of my homes. And I feel great comfort in being there. When Barbara spoke about the Beth David Synagogue on Thursday morning and the Beit Medrash, it's again, I've been there many, many times. I've said Kaddish there many times. And there's just a great, great sense of warmth in that imagery and in the reality that we're back in Shul, at least on Thursday mornings. By the way, I think, I always think, and I've mentioned this before, about, was it Faye Gans who lamed on Rosh Chodesh? I can't hear you, Noreen.
Probably Faye Major.
No. It's Faye Gans.
Rita Drutz.
Oh, Rita Drutz, Harvey says.
And her mother, Mrs. Gans, did on Rosh Chodesh.
Right, Mrs. Gans, Gita.
Gita, there we go.
Gita. Yeah.
Gita would lay on Rosh Chodesh.
Right,
when I went up to her the first time I heard it, I was amazed because she was in her mid-80s at the time. And I thought, my God, what a progressive human being that is, how growth oriented.
Yeah.
And I remember recording her, and I sent her family a recording of her laning. She was really, really excited about it. She was a great, very, very fine human being.
Yes, she was.
Miss her a lot. Miss her a lot. Yeah, she was really special. So we've covered some really good ground here so far. Talking about, really, it's predicated on the whole idea of proud to be a Jew. And I will remind you that the reason why we chose these topics, or this approach, why it's predicated on proud to be a Jew, is because I am proud to be a Jew. And I guess you would think, well, that goes without saying. And of course it does. I was born into a rabbinical home. But the truth of the matter is that I've been studying Torah very intensely the last 3 years. We're coming up to January, God willing, and by then I'll have finished, I think, 13 or 14 Gemaras, predicated on the Daf Yomi cycle. I also give a weekly shir on Chumash, which obviously you're all invited to, Thursday nights at 7 on Zoom. And through that whole process, I've really come to learn much more about our people through our teachings. And when I was younger, I took a very young approach to Torah. It was nice. We studied the Torah stories, Abraham and Sarah, and they were all really nice stories. But the depth that one can take away from them, if indeed they ensconce themselves in the Meforshim, in the interpretations, in the Midrashim, etc., you can't get that unless you really, really are. Your objective is to tackle the Torah. In other words, to dig deeply, to tear pieces of it apart and put it back together, and have a deep understanding of it. So with that has come an awful lot of pride. And the example that I often give is that, and I wish that there would be more teachings like this amongst our people. as an example, is that when you take a look at the concept of Yovel, the concept of Jubilee, essentially it's predicated on the idea that only a certain amount of people, a 1% of the people, we'll use our terms from today, should not be the only people where wealth is concentrated. Yovel comes along, God comes along and says, look, every 49 years, you have to return that piece of land to the original owners. Going on the premise that the original owners is a little bit of Soros and had some problems, because God is saying, look, I don't want the 99% of the rest of the nation to be selling themselves out as slaves, to be indentured servants. I want to make sure that there's equity within our wealth and that it's spread out amongst all peoples. So Yovel comes along and it creates this economic model, which is very, very reciprocal, which is very equitable, and which, quite frankly, is very, very progressive. So I start to learn all these various different concepts and dig deeply, as I said, and came to the realization that there are some beautiful models within Judaism that if we were aware of them, if we're more aware of them, then it could be that more people will have that type of pride. I've always had pride in being a Jew in terms of Tikkun Olam, of course, because of my work with Via Havta. And there's so many aspects of Judaism that I celebrate. But when it comes to Torah, digging very deeply in terms of our tradition and our learning and our understanding, and really what is at the core of who we are as a people, which is the Torah, um, my pride has grown a lot. So tonight we're sort of coming at this from a different point of view. Tonight we are looking at, we will call them the righteous Gentiles, the righteous among the nations, which, by the way, is a concept, which is a phrase that one would find in the Torah, and it refers to the non-Jew, it refers to the Gentile. Normally, when we speak about the righteous amongst the nations, we call them righteous Gentiles. We are generally nowadays talking about the non-Jewish response to the Holocaust. And because that is so prevalent in terms of our understanding of the non-Jewish response to the Jew, and there's quite a bit of information on it, we will be focusing largely on that tonight. Before we go there, there's two things I want to establish about the Jewish relationship with the non-Jew, the non-Jewish response to the Jew. The first thing is that I'm a very big proponent on the Jewish world making friends with the non-Jew. While that may sound kind of trite, in essence, what I am saying is, per my experience, through Via Havta, through growing up in Kitchener and other environments, I'm convinced that we have many, many friends out there. Many friends out there. The voice of the anti-Semite is very loud. We all know that. The anti-Semite very often is bad, is evil, and evil people very often have very, very booming voices to get their point across. Very often their actions are not quite as booming um, because they're often very cowardice. But uh, um, there are many individuals whom I'm sure you have met too through your sojourn, through your trek in life, through your work, through your neighborhood, through various committees, etc., that you belong to, working with a non-Jew and recognizing very, very quickly that there are non-Jews who are very curious about us. They wonder about our Jewishness because the truth of the matter is, up until the last few years, we've been very guarded about who we are as Jews. Social media has changed a lot of that. If a non-Jew wants to learn Torah, there's plenty of places where they can. There are other non-Jews, Gentiles, who embrace us like very, very strongly. And some of them, of course, are evangelical, but there is another group who understand, I believe, that again, at the core of the Jewish people is great respect for humankind. And it's great devotion and loyalty to the development of the collective and the world in which we live. You'll hear nowadays the response to Kanye West from people who are within his community, the Afro-American community, who are very angry with what he has to say and in their own way protective of the Jewish people, often in the guise of racism is wrong, whichever way it's directed. And you will hear from certain people about the experiences that they have had with our people, which have been highly, highly productive and very, very positive. I like to think, and of course, anybody and everybody could accuse me of being biased, but I like to think that they're getting it. I like to think that they're getting it. This group of people that we're here with tonight, I personally think it's probably appropriate to say that we're all lovers of the Jewish people. And if I were to ask each and every one of you, what is it that you love about the Jewish people? You get it. You're part of our people. You're part of the culture. You know what goes on behind the scenes. Sometimes maybe that's not so nice. What goes on in front of the scenes, right? What we're doing in the world, what Eretz Yisrael has produced in the last very few years in terms of being cutting edge in technology and health, v'chulu, et cetera, et cetera. We have reason to be proud. We don't have reason to be arrogant. Nobody has reason to be arrogant, but we definitely have reason to have nachas. And I like to think that those non-Jews who have some sort of nachas, pride in who we are as a people, and therefore want to emulate us more so than disparage us, they get what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is to be a light unto the nation, right? Which is what God told us to be a light unto the nation, to go into the world like Avram Avinu and Sarah in this week's Parsha, and to go and influence people on the godliness of our existence, and ultimately to introduce them to Judaism. So before we dive into the righteous amongst the nations, are there any thoughts on what I just said? Any response to that? Anything that you're thinking? Agree or disagree? You're welcome to disagree with me as well. Relate? Yes, Noreen. Yes.
Okay, so when you were talking like that, all I could think of was when I was a kid growing up in Welland, where there were 30 Jewish families, and I was probably the only Jew in my grade. I was always the one that had to explain the Jewish holidays. I see Ruth with a smile on her face, and what matzah was, and to bring something to show. And it got, after 6 or 7 years of that, it got to be a real pain. And I don't know that they got anything at all, except one more reason not to like Noreen David. However, I did survive, and I came to Toronto, and I had never seen young men, wearing a kippah all the time. I never saw that. I never knew there were so many Jews in one place. So it was a real eye opener to come to Toronto.
Yeah, I happen to think, not by happenstance, I think that we are all emissaries of the Jewish people. We are. We're shlichim, no matter where we are. Like if I ask my dear friend Jeff Budd, who's here with us tonight, Jeff lives in Kitchener, right? Kitchener used to be Little Berlin. And that's where I grew up. My father was a rabbi there. My mother was a rebbitzin. And Jeff is an important member of the shul there. He's head of the Chaver Kadisha. Jeff, yes or no? Do you feel like an emissary of the Jewish people?
Sure, here in Kitchener for sure.
Yeah,
Every
how
time,
so?
every time the non-Jews have a question about something Jewish, they always come to my family because they know us. And I had the same experience growing up here. I was the only Jew in my class, always having to explain it to everybody, and in a very German town. So, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I think that as a young person, I too was an emissary at a young age, and Noreen, I didn't like it. I didn't like being separated. I didn't like being different. And I learned that when I was, I'm raising my son, and he had very, very long hair. I don't know where he got that from, but he had very long hair. And when he was probably about 8 or 9 years old, he came to his mom and I, and he said he no longer wanted very long hair. And we said, "Why? You look so cute, you know?" And his response was, "I don't want to be different than anybody else." And it's those moments, the sort of epiphanies, where you start to realize, yeah, that's right. Kids don't want to be different than anybody else. That's a huge piece about being a young person. So, Noreen, I completely get your sentiment because that was my sentiment in Kitchener too. I too was the only Jew in my school. And then on top of that, the rabbi's son. So, we had, well, here's the rabbi's son. He can tell us about all this. I didn't want to, I wasn't interested. I just wanted to fit in like everybody else. So I understand your sentiment, but I would say as we get older, in particular, we can't help but be emissaries for the Jewish. We can't help it. If we're in Shoppers Drug Mart and we overhear a conversation of people about Jews and they're a little bit off or they're a little bit tilted in a way that we're not comfortable with, how often have any of us said, "Excuse me, your information is a little bit off," or "Can I add to that?" Or on the bus, or on the subway, or what have you? By definition of a Jew, especially we Jews who are involved in community, you can't help but be an emissary. And that's a really important piece that Noreen brings up because it speaks to the relationship that the Jews and the non-Jews have. We, by definition, have an obligation, as I said before, to be a light unto the nations. We have never proselytized. There was a short period in history where we actually did, but nothing substantial. And the Torah tells us that we must go out into the world and we must make the world a better place. And by definition, that means dealing with the non-Jew. We know from the Parsha this week, the story of Stum, that Avrum was fighting on behalf of the people of Stum who were not Jewish, who were not even good people, right? But yet he had an argument and debate with God. If there's 50 righteous people in Stum, will you save it? Or actually, it was 5 cities. If there's 45, if there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 20, and he goes all the way down to 10. And in the end, he's quiet because he knows that there's not. And the Torah basically says, and God walks away. God said, okay, you debated, you made your point. You care about the world, you care about the non-Jew, kol hakavod, good for you, because they're my creations too, but there aren't 10 righteous people. Very interesting, by the way, on Pesach, we say Hallel. On the first day, we say Hallel, the entire Hallel. On the rest of Pesach, we only say half the Hallel. Because on the seventh day of Pesach, we celebrate, we remember, we learn about Kriyat Yam Suf, about the splitting of the sea. And of course, what happened when the sea was split? The Jews came through and we were rescued. Yetziat Mitzrayim. We were rescued, right? Through God's mercy and justice, the Jewish people were saved from enslavement and ultimately made it across that body of water safe and went on to eventually go into Canaan, which was Israel. But at the same time, the Egyptians' army was killed. They were killed. And the angels came out and they started to celebrate. And God said, you need to stop that. Why? Because this is a creation of my hands. This is something that I made too. I didn't just make the Jew, I made the non-Jew as well. And you're all equally as important in my eyes. And therefore you cannot celebrate. So on Pesach, we only say half Hallel after the first day because we are remembering those who perished despite the fact that they were our enemy. Any thoughts or questions?
I think Marion has a question.
Yes, please, Miriam.
Well, I find that growing up, all I had was anti-Semitism because there were very few. I was in the Oakwood, Sinclair area, and there weren't too many Jews. And I found I had to sit in a class while everybody went to up to sing Christmas carols. And I was called a dirty Jew constantly.
Yes.
But I must say that in my adult life that I have found that we're all the same people and that I have a lot of friends who are non-Jews and they're very anxious to know about our holidays, which I tell them. And they're very want to be knowledgeable. They want to know the stories. And I find that wonderful. So there's a difference from when I was growing up that many years ago to now when people are more inquisitive and want to treat us, as you say, like mention, and learn about Judaism.
Yes. So, Marion, my first response to you is, as a fellow Jew, I'm terribly sorry that you went through that as a child because it's very disparaging. It's a terrible feeling to be called a dirty Jew, isn't it? It's a
Constant.
terrible feeling, right? And I think when people try to minimize anti-Semitism by saying, "Oh, the Jews are doing so well, let them stop," complaining, because I hear this a lot. I'm on social media quite a bit, and I'm very often debating anti-Semites or people who are disparaging towards Jews. And the response very often is, "What do you guys have to worry about? You look how rich your community is. Look how well you're doing." And I think they missed the point. But really, what I'm trying to say is, I'm embracing you as a fellow Jew, Marion, and I understand your feelings because I was also called a dirty Jew, and it was a very, very awful thing, especially as a young person. As an older person, we're a little bit more equipped to deal with it, right? We also know we can reach out to the B'nai B'rith and to the ADL and to the Federation and to Friends of Simon Wiesenthal. We're not alone. But when you're the only kid in your class, or you're the only Jewish kid in the school, for all intents and purposes, from 9 till 3:30, you are alone as a Jew, right? Am I right, Marion?
Yes.
So, kol hakavod to you for expressing what you went through and actually for being there and letting people know how beautiful the Jewish people are through you. But I feel terribly that any of us have to go through that. Just out of curiosity, please put up your hands if you've had anti-Semitic incidents happen in your life directed at you. Okay, so put down your hands. Put up your hands if you've had, I'm going to be kind of silly here and trite, but I'm trying to make a point. If you've had 5 or 10 anti-Semitic acts directed at you. Okay. Okay. So Brian, so would you say that you've been exposed to quite a bit of anti-Semitism?
Uh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Uh, in my younger days, there was a lot more physical violence, whether it was at the Forest Hill ice skate arena or whether it was walking to shul. I wore a kippah all the time, and I got physically beaten up on multiple occasions by just gangs, by just groups of other young people. You called me a effing Jew or and took swings at me till we fought back, and you got a little bit bloody, but there was quite a bit of it. When I got into the business world, it wasn't physical, but it was more comments, and I was a little more equipped to respond to the comments because I had the confidence to do that. But even today, I think that there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. I think Toronto's a unique place in that, you can walk down the street wearing a kippah or a shtreimel or anything else, and 99 out of 100 times you won't get a negative comment or beaten up. But you can't say that about the rest of the world. South America and Central America, in Europe, even in London. I was in London for a few months. Tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and today. So I'm not as optimistic. I agree with your comment about being a light to the nations, and we still have to be a mensch and portray ourselves as proud Jews. And to me, that has a bigger impact than a response. My father always said, first thing, be a mensch. Second thing, be a proud Jew. Because by being a mensch, you're able to portray what the other side used to look down on. They're now looking at somebody who is a mensch. It's very hard to put down a mensch, and they'll respond to that. But yeah, there was multiple. Like we had lots of instances where we got beaten up on a regular basis. Sometimes we came across and we won, and sometimes we lost.
Yeah, I think we're more on the same page than you know. I happen to agree with you that being a mensch, really a role model, is the key thing. But having started and run Via Hafta, I also recognize that it's very important to reach out, to actively reach out. I believe. Look, I believe that the Jewish people is a pie. And I believe that you'll find within that pie a slice which we call Haredi. And I believe you'll find a slice in there which we'll call conservative Jews and Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews. And you'll find Tikkun Olam Jews. And everybody plays an important role in it. Sometimes people would be critical of me and say, well, why are you getting, funds to help the non-Jew who hates the Jew anyway? And my response was, number one, it's called Darkei Shalom. Everything that we do at Via Hafta, the starting point is the Jewish people, right? I want people to recognize who we are at our essence. And who we are at our essence is a people who care and who want to make this world a better place. So when we go out and help the non-Jew, of course we're concerned about the welfare of those people. Of course we are. But really, we're also very, very worrying, and we're very conscious of what we're doing for the Jewish people as well. So everybody has a role to play. And I, by the way, am very supportive of those guys who sit in Beis Medrash and learn Torah. I think that they're a slice of the pie. And I think they do something which is enormously important as well. Yes, Noreen.
I have friends who say things like that. How can you give to the people living in the park? How can you collect clothes and whatever for the church at the corner? And I have served dinner at one of the churches at the corner with my National Council of Jewish Women group. And you don't know who's eating that dinner.
True.
We cooked what all of us would prepare as a Shabbos dinner, a lovely chicken and side dish and dessert and whatever. And you get comments from the kids. These are like teenage, early 20s kids. Oh, just like my Bubby used to make. Well, no non-Jewish kid would say just like my Bubby used to make. So you don't know, you're doing a mitzvah because you're a good person, but you don't know who's sitting there eating your mitzvah. And I think that's how you have to treat people. Like, they could be Jewish. Their parents could have thrown them out because they don't want a gay child or they don't want a drug addict child. But your job is to help them survive.
Yes. Look, like I said, I agree with you, Noreen, but I once was giving a speech at Habonim during the time of the war in the Balkans. And I was working on helping the people there. And I said how important it is for us to facilitate some sort of humanitarian response to the ills of what was going on in that terrible, terrible war. Not that a war can be good. This one was really, really gruesome. Anyways, a man came up to me later. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he started to yell at me. And he says, "Well, you think we should be helping the Goyim? You think so? Yeah, do you have any idea what the Croats did to us during the war?" And I said, "Sir, you know what? I'm sorry. I apologize. I wasn't speaking to you. I don't believe you have any obligation to help anyone you don't want to help. You are a survivor of the Holocaust, and I only bless you with peace in your life. I did not mean to offend you, but I was not speaking to you." And I think that's really important. We all play a different role. And as long as we're doing something of significance to help the Jewish people, to strengthen who we are as a nation, to give us security as a nation, to make this world a better place. I think that it's all significant, unless it's entirely wonky, but I think it's all significant. So let me just let me move forward on this. I'm actually really touched and really happy that the conversation is going this way. I actually think there's a really, really big opportunity within our community to have more of this. Why? Because I think there are Jews out there suffering at the hands of all the anti-Semitism going on in our world. And I think there's very little place to talk about it. I think we as a healthy people, to be even healthier, need to get out there and express our views. So when Brian tells us, excuse me, what went on in his life and what goes on in business, that is significant to all of us today. You know, when Noreen talks, when Anna Bloom talks, when anybody talks, it sort of brings us together more so and gives us a sense of understanding what we're going through and a greater sense of security. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the righteous among the nations. But before I do, I just want to break up our talk a little bit by telling you a story. And this is a story that I heard from my dear, very, very dear friend, a brother, I would say. That's how dear of a friend he is, Ellie Rubenstein. Does anyone know Ellie? Ellie's a spiritual leader, Congregation Habonim, and he is also was the national director of March of the Living. Marion, you know Ellie? Yeah. So Ellie is a righteous human being. He's a righteous human being. He's a righteous Jew. He's just a righteous everything. I know very few people like it, and he would be very upset if he knew that I was talking about him this way right now. So really, he's an awful person. I don't like him at all. So Ellie has spoken far and wide about the Holocaust. He's a Holocaust scholar, I would say, and he, of course, is talking within that. He's spoken within that light about the righteous Gentile, the righteous among the nations, and I think he has a very compassionate view of many of the people in Europe and their response to the Jewish community, to the Jewish people at the time of the Holocaust. He says there were very, very bad people. There were very evil people, terrible people who, quite frankly, went and they would shoot a whole family or hang a whole family. And then there were other people who did some very righteous things. What those numbers are, when you take a look at Yad Vashem and how many trees have been planted on behalf of the righteous Gentiles from all the nations of Europe and otherwise, you would say, well, that's not very much, Avram. And the truth of the matter is, it's not relative to the amount of people who were in Eastern Europe. The last I heard on Yad Vashem video was that there were about 11,000 trees that were planted on behalf of the righteous Gentiles. When I look at the numbers, however, on their website, their numbers actually equal from all the nations across Europe and otherwise. Their numbers equal about 27,000. So still not a huge number, but we'll talk about maybe why that number is not as great as one may think. But before we do that, I want to tell you a story that Ellie told me. These are very short stories. I'll tell you one at a time. A woman was boarding a train in France, and she was trembling, zittering, as we say in Yiddish, just zittering, right? And she sits down next to a man, and this is during the Holocaust, during the Nazi regime. And this man turns to her. He said, "Why are you trembling?" She had nothing to lose at that point, just very little hope. And she said, "You know what? I'm going to trust this man. I don't know why," but she said to him, "I'm a Jew. And I don't have my papers." As soon as she told him this, the train stopped, and a Nazi boarded the plane, boarded the train, and started to come down the aisle. And as you can imagine, she started to zitter. She started to tremble even more. And as the Nazi comes closer to them, this man that she's sitting next to starts to yell at her. "What are you doing? You're embarrassing us, right? How is it that you forget everything?" Well, the Nazi comes over and he says, "Well, what's going on here?" He goes, "You can see, I'm a citizen of France. Here's my papers. Everything's in order. I have my glasses on my nose. My tie is done up properly, but not my wife. She forgets everything. She forgets her glasses. She forgets her purse. She forgets her papers. And he was like in a huff. Well, the Nazi said to the man, he said, "Stop this. Control yourself. I want control on this train. Next time, make sure that you bring your papers." Train continued on. The Nazi got off. The train continued on. And at the next stop, the man stood up, didn't say a word to her, got off the train, and left. And she never saw him again, and he saved her life. What do you think of that story? A touching story. Eh? Isn't that a touching story? Very touching story. So I have more stories to tell you, courtesy of Ellie Rubenstein, as we go on. So let me tell you a little bit about righteous Gentiles. I want to start with a question, okay? The Yad Vashem created a program called the Righteous Among the Nations program. And they decided that they were going to collect the names of righteous Gentiles and put them together in that environment, in a particular environment within Yad Vashem. And we were going to honor those people who save Jews. Now, there were criteria. We've all been at Yad Vashem, right? Everyone here been at Yad Vashem? Yeah. So there were criteria as to what a righteous among the nation would be. In other words, what was required for a person's name or a family's name to be put into Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. So let me open this up for a second. You're on that committee at Yad Vashem, and they come to you and they say, Kinderlach, we're going to start a Righteous Among the Nations program, and we need criteria for who is allowed to be qualified as a righteous Gentile. What are some of the criteria? Just throw it out there. Anybody.
They had to have saved some Jews. Like Jeff Van Beber saved my mother. He had saved other people, but some of them they were still caught because he was caught, and then they were caught because of him. But he still saved my mother.
Ruth, who saved your mother? Sorry.
Jeff Van Beber was in Holland, and he was saving Jews, and he was also saving pilots who in the underground. And he was captured by the Nazis in July of 1944. And because of that, there was the names of my mother and her family were at his parents' house. And then they went to his parents' house and they found my mother and family. But he's a righteous among the nations. But
Did he
was
survive?
shot.
He was
No,
shot and killed?
he was shot. After they were captured, they were at the police station, and they came up to my mother and they were asking her questions, and she acted like she was an idiot and she didn't know anything. And she'd say, I don't know. No.
Has that had a huge effect on your life, that whole
Yeah,
situation?
Mar, do you think, Margie? Margie's my sister. Yeah. I mean, the family, like this, the family was interesting because he had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters, and one of his sisters worked for the Nazis as a cook. Okay. And she used to come home every 2 weeks, and she had food, and that was how they had food for my mother, and like there was 8 of them. Yes. Being hidden in the attic.
Yes. The reason thank you for sharing that, Ruth. The reason why I'm asking everybody how this affected them is because it's another thing that we need to discuss. It's another thing that the Jewish people, I think, need to face. When my brother-in-law was murdered, obviously over the next few years, I saw the effect that it had on my sister and her 6 children. They were traumatized, And I personally think that our people have been traumatized by Nazis, by Nazi Germany, by the Holocaust. And as we put our head high and we go through life and we do our very best to be functional and to do a good job, there's no question about it. stories like that. Ruth Shapiro's mother had to be saved by a non-Jew because she was hunted as a Jew. She was hunted because she was a Jew. That has an effect on who we are as a people and as individuals. So really something to think about. And Ruth, thank you for sharing that. And God bless your family. God bless your family. So they had to have saved a Jew. So Ruth is correct. Let me just expound upon that, okay? This is really interesting stuff. They had to be actively involved in the rescue and saving one or several Jews from the threat of death or deportation to death camps. So there we go. Number two is there had to be a risk to the rescuer's life, liberty, or their position. Okay? Number three, the initial motivation being the intention to help persecuted Jews, i.e., not for payment or any other reward, such as religious conversion of the saved person, adoption of a child. That's a very Jewish committee response, right? It's like, okay, so you saved that Jewish family, good. And how much money did you make? Well, we made 300 rubies or whatever it was, you know? Sorry, that's not a righteous person, right? Or we saved them and we converted them to Christianity. And while I think there was a place for that, right, that can't be the sole motivation. The existence of testimony of those who were helped, or at least unequivocal documentation establishing the nature of the rescue and its circumstances. So, what is that saying? There has to be a secondary proof of this rescue, and very often they'll have witnesses or they'll bring people forward. I don't know the process, I don't know who would be a valid witness, but it obviously has to be substantiated. Number seven, persons recognized as righteous among the nations are awarded. I'm sorry. How are they honored? They're awarded a specially minted medal and a certificate of honor, both bearing their name as well as the privilege of their name being added to the wall of honor in the garden of the righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And the Yad Vashem law authorizes Yad Vashem to confer honorary citizenship of the state of Israel upon the righteous among the nation and commemorative citizenship if they have passed away in recognition of their actions. So there are actually, believe it or not, there are a number of righteous Gentiles who actually made Israel their home. And one of the reasons they did that was because there was an example that I read of a righteous among the nations of a woman who saved this little boy, and she purported to be his mother throughout the war. After the war was over, the little boy said to her, I want you to continue to be my mother. You are my mother, because his real mother was murdered. Okay. And then eventually she had him taken out of Europe. She left Europe and she went to Israel, and they both settled in Israel. And she made it her home, despite the fact that she was, I believe, Polish and Catholic. So you would find instances of that. The group is not huge of righteous Gentiles who are living in Israel, but they are there. Now, it's interesting that one thing that we talked about a few minutes ago is the numbers. How many righteous Gentiles there are. Now, let me tell you from a list of about 40 countries, perhaps more, let me tell you the top 5 or 10 nations in terms of their number of righteous Gentiles. Okay, so you have very small ones like Portugal had 3. According to Yad Vashem, Japan had 1. Interesting, Canada's not on the list. But some of the countries with many righteous Gentiles is Belgium, has 1,774. By the way, the Danes have 22, and of course we all know that the entire nation, protected the Jewish people. So there's an asterisk next to the number 22, and it says the title of righteous is awarded to individuals, not groups. The members of the Danish resistance viewed the rescue operations as a collective act and therefore asked Yad Vashem not to recognize resistant members individually, and Yad Vashem respected their request, and consequently the number of Danish righteous is relatively small. Interesting, no? Okay, let's continue here. The Netherlands has 5,910. Lithuania has 918. It's interesting because we wouldn't think that from Lithuania or at first blush. Poland has 7,177. France has 4,150. And the Ukraine has 2,673. Slovakia has 621. Italy has 744. Collectively, from all of these countries, again, as I said before, there are about 27,921 righteous Gentiles in Yad Vashem. Okay? So let me ask you a question. Why aren't the numbers higher? Why aren't the numbers higher? Any thoughts on that?
Since they
Ru-
needed to have, since they needed to have somebody who was alive, I think that a lot of them maybe, like my mother was captured, but still, you know, she had there was and my father was not captured, and he was, but I don't think he ever did anything about the people that put
Yeah,
them in hiding, had them in hiding. So I think a lot of times the names got, weren't said anything about.
yeah. Ruth, that's
I,
exactly right. That's exactly right. Did you want to say something else? Sorry.
no, I was thinking like, a lot of times the persons were dead, like the other people were
Yeah,
dead.
yeah. Very good. It needs to be noted that the numbers of righteous recognized do not reflect the full extent of help given by non-Jews to Jews during the Holocaust. This is from Yad Vashem, folks. They are rather based on the material and documentation that was made available to Yad Vashem. Most righteous were recognized following the request made by the rescued Jew. Right, Ruth? That's what you're saying. Most righteous were recognized following the request made by the rescued Jews. So people who had been rescued came forward and they said to Yad Vashem, I was rescued by this Polish family and I want them to be honored. Sometimes survivors could not overcome the difficulty of grappling with the painful past and they didn't come forward. They just didn't say anything, And who are we to judge that? Of course. Number three, others weren't aware of the program or couldn't apply it, especially those behind the Iron Curtain. Other survivors died before they could make the request. And then an additional factor is that most cases that are recognized represent successful attempts. The Jews survived and came forward to tell Yad Vashem about them. Okay, before we move forward, I just want to tell you another story that I had gotten once again from Ellie. This is a very short little one. There was a fellow by the name of Nicholas Winton. Has anyone ever heard of him? Nicholas Winton. Doreen, you know about Nicholas Winton? So he lived in England. And one day after the war, his wife went up to the attic and she found there etchings in the wall of children's names and various numbers attached to them, facts that kids will write and scrawl into a wall. His wife comes down and she says to him, Dude, Nicholas, what is this? What's going on here? Look what I found in the attic. And he turned to her, he said, a husband doesn't tell a wife everything. And the truth be told, that when the war was starting, what Nicholas Winston did, Ellie believes it's the former Czechoslovakia, he got out somewhere in the area of 500 children and he sheltered them, obviously not all in his attic, but some and in other places. Um, what happened was his wife went to the BBC and she told her about her husband, Nicholas Winton. You may want to write this down because you might want to see the video on YouTube. Nicholas Winton, Winton. So Nicholas Winton is invited by the BBC to come and to be honored and to be awarded for what he had done, for being so brave and being a hero. Long and short of it, the program starts. He's sitting in the front row. There's many people in the audience. And the MC says to Nicholas Winton, he says, do you know that woman who's sitting next to you? No, I don't know. Who is she? I don't know. He says, you saved her life during the war. And you see that person sitting on the other side of you, you saved his life. And in fact, I would ask anybody here who Nicholas Winton saved to please stand up. And the entire audience stood up. And when I tell you this, I have what they say in Hebrew, smarmoret. I have goosebumps. Because what I think is, that speaks to the idea that, one person can accomplish so much and save so many lives. And, the classic question in the Torah is, well, we say that when a person saves one life, it's like saving the world. Well, what does that mean? What do you mean it's like saving the world? The reason is because if you go back in history, if you take a look at your genealogy, you will see that there's millions of people who came before you and are part of your lineage. So what happens is when you save one life, that person gets married, they have a child, they have 2 children, 5 children. Those 5 children have, 2, 3 children each, v'chulu, v'chulu, and it goes on and on. And if you go really decades and centuries into the future, you'll see that one life that you saved turns out to be thousands, if not perhaps a million. So Nicholas Winton saved many, many lives. And you have to see the video, because when you see it, if you can't find it on YouTube, let me know, because I have Ellie's video of his speech that he gave. And it's just absolutely amazing. In Yad Vashem, on their website, you will find many documents having to do with individuals who actually rescued or saved a Jew. And the stories are aplenty, and I would, if you don't mind, I would like to tell you one of the stories. And the woman whom I speak of, her name is Irene Obdik, Opdyke, Opdyke. How would you say that? Opdyke. It's a Polish name. How? Obdyke or something like that. Okay. Irene, we'll just call her Irene. Irene was once an interior decorator, and her stylish townhouse in Lomita, California, reflects her attention to her surroundings. Her attractive appearance, her Zsa Zsa Gabor accent, we all remember Zsa Zsa Gabor, and sense of drama make her a popular and compelling speaker of the Holocaust. Furthermore, her story of rescue in Warsaw would make a riveting film, and the ending where she saved all 18 Jews is one of success. Unlike some rescuers, she's not shy about talking about her deeds, feeling it is her responsibility to tell children about the price of hate and the courage of a few. So she says, I never talked about what I did during the war, and I still wouldn't be talking about it if I hadn't read that article in the newspaper in the early 70s that said that the Holocaust never happened. That started my Polish blood cooking, and I said, well, I have to speak out. And that's the reason I put my time, my heart, my feelings into speaking about the war to so many groups all over the country. If someone would say I had to go back to do the same thing to be able to help people, she says, I would do it without question. I was born in Poland in 1921. My family was Catholic, and my mother was such a strong influence. She didn't have much schooling, but she was smart. And she never turned away anybody from her doorstep. We 5 girls were always bringing in animals which needed help. You can see what sort of family we're talking about. And this is really, really important, because when you take a look at studies done on who were the righteous Gentiles, it's you know what it is? It's those kids who were brought up in a highly empathetic way. It's those kids who were walking along the side of the road, and they would see someone sitting there who was poor, was hungry, who needed a drink. It was a hot day, and who would go over, and they were trained, they were taught to ask per their welfare. Okay? So when you read these stories, you see that it wasn't like my mother would say, it wasn't just pinked, that they would see, oh, there's a need here. Oh, I better do something. No. They were trained to be empathetic. Do you know that empathy is a trained behavior? Empathy is a trained behavior. In other words, if you're wondering, well, why aren't I more empathetic or why aren't my children more empathetic? Train them on it because it is a trained behavior. So let's continue. So Irene says, I always wanted to be a nurse to help people. In 1939, when I was 18 years old, I was 200 miles from home in central Poland in nursing school. I joined the Polish army with other nurses. One night we were captured by Russian soldiers who had invaded Poland. 3 of them beat me, and the next thing I knew, I was on a truck to a Russian hospital. Later, I was able to return to Poland on an exchange between Russia and Poland, and I began working in a munitions factory that supplied the German front. One day, because of the fumes, I fainted at the feet of a German major. I looked German because I was blonde and blue-eyed, but when he asked me if I was German, I said I wasn't. He liked that I was honest, so he gave me a job working in the kitchen and serving meals to German soldiers. One day I was running an errand and I found myself in the ghetto. There were all kinds of people, pregnant women, children screaming, Mama, Mama. Then I saw a woman with an infant in her arms. With one movement of his hand, the SS man pulled the baby away and threw it to the ground. I could not understand, but later on I realized that God gave us free will to be good or to be bad. So I asked God for forgiveness, and I said if the opportunity arrived, I would help these people. Soon the German major was transferred to another Polish town, Ternopil, and he took me with him. There I met 12 Jewish people who worked in the Gestapo laundry room. We became friends. They had been people of means, businessmen and women, a medical student, a lawyer, a nurse. I thought we were all the same. We were all in trouble, and the Germans were our enemy. One night when I was serving dinner, I heard the German officer making plans to raid the ghetto. The Gestapo man said, Herr Major, Thursday or Friday, don't count on the Jews to come to work. I realized that was the day that they would make the raid on the barracks. I started getting the message to the laundry room, and they got the word around. Many people were able to escape. Then one day I heard them making plans to wipe out the whole ghetto in Ternopil, and I knew this meant my friend in the laundry room would be killed. I didn't know what to do. Then a miracle happened. About 3 days later, the major called me and said, I have a villa, and I want you to be my housekeeper. I knew then that could be the place that I would hide the Jews. They stayed in the attic when the major was downstairs and in the cellar when he was upstairs. Just imagine that. I tried to wrap my head around that. Then we had a real problem to deal with. One couple was expecting a baby, and we knew the child would cry and make too much noise. They said they'd give up the child, but I said, Ida, please wait. Don't do anything. We'll see. You'll be free. Then one day in the middle of the marketplace, they hanged a Polish couple with their 2 children and a Jewish couple with their little child. They forced us to stay and watch to see what happened because there were signs on every street corner saying they would do that if you helped Jews. I ran home to my friends. 3 of my friends were in the kitchen. I was so shaken that I forgot to leave my key in the lock after I locked the door. This was the way I would protect us from the major coming in unexpectedly. We were talking, and all of a sudden, the major was standing in the kitchen. He was looking from one to another, trembling, and he didn't say one word. He went to the library. I ran out after him, and he was screaming at me, I trusted you. How could you do this behind my back in my own house? How? Why? I cried. I said, they are my friends. I was kissing his hands, holding his knees. He said, no, I am an old man. I have to go now. I'll give you my decision when I return. After a few hours, he returned and said he'd help me, but for a price. He would keep my secret, but I had to be his, and willingly, too. There was no other way. I won't tell you it was easy, not only because he was an old man, but I still remembered the Russians raping me. But I knew there were 12 lives depending on me. This went on for several months until the Germans started losing. Everyone left the villa and we fled into the forest. We had a radio and we knew the front was coming. Then the Russians came and we were free. And on May 4th, 1944, a little boy was born in freedom. That was my payment for whatever hell I went through, seeing that little boy. His name was Roman Heller. After the war, I joined the Polish partisans, hoping to find my family, but instead I was arrested by the Russians. Some Jewish friends helped me escape to Germany. I went to a Jewish displaced persons camp with all the Jews who were homeless after the war. From that camp, they helped people settle in Allied countries, and a group of men came from the United Nations to the camp. One was American, and he interviewed me, and he said that America would be proud to have me. So I came here in 1949 to the United States alone. I didn't know a word of English. I worked in a union shop sewing, and then I met a Polish Jewish woman who gave me a job, and we have been friends ever since. One day in New York, a man came up to me on the street and he said, Irene, you don't remember me, but you brought me shoes in the forest. There were so many of these people that I didn't really know. So for 5 years, I lived alone working. Then one day I went to the UN to have lunch in the cafeteria, and I started talking with a man, and all of a sudden I realized he was the man who interviewed me. At the same time, he was a widower. He asked me to go out for dinner. 6 weeks later, we were married, and 2 years later, in 1957, we had a daughter. I was busy working as an interior designer, raising my daughter, and traveling a lot with my husband, but I still miss my family in Poland. One night, my husband brought a woman home for dinner, and she stayed with us for 14 years. Her name was Vivian Bennett. She was a wonderful lady, and she was going blind. She had no one to help her out through her eye surgery, so I told her that she could stay with us. She spent her last $1,500 on the surgery, and from then on, I took care of her. She was so intelligent, there wasn't a subject she didn't know about. I'll stop a little bit earlier because our time is limited, but I think what I take away from this story uh, is that this woman Irene was a very sensitive person, and she had been trained by her parents, obviously, to be caring of others. And while that can be very onerous and often very dangerous, certainly in times like that, the truth of the matter is the question of should I save these Jews was more of how am I going to save these Jews? In other words, to Irene, it wasn't a question. She didn't grapple with the ethics of it, the morality of it, the crime of it, the criminality of not doing so, criminality of doing so in Nazi Germany. She said, these are human beings just like me. They are my friends. She qualified them as being equal. And we all know that Nazi Germany's intention was to make Jews into something less than equal, and to do that with the Roma and homosexuals and people who were physically handicapped. So this is one of many, many stories, and more stories clearly than have been documented. And I think it behooves us to be very conscious of it, to obviously honor Irene by telling her story. I don't know if she's alive or not, but just by remembering her and what she has done is so significant. And also by recognizing that there are many, many, many people out there who are our friends, And it's really important that we develop a relationship with our friends. Now, they could be acquaintances. In other words, not really our friends, but people who know us. They could be people who simply respect us. Or they could be our friends, again, who people we have over, just they're our friends. It's important that we know that as Jews, that we do have friends, and one such person was Irene. So with that, let me open up for any questions that you might have, please. Or thoughts, any thoughts you might have.
I think it's an important lesson to learn what you just said. I mean, how many times did people think I was not important enough? I never got asked to a school dance, or I had a few girlfriends, but that was really it, And they liked my father's menswear store.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you really have to remember that they are human beings just like us. There are good and there are not so good, and we have to do the best that we can.
Where was your father's menswear store?
42 East Main Street in Welland.
Oh, in Welland, eh? And
Yeah,
what did he sell?
Menswear.
Like suits and things like that, right?
Suits, yeah, work clothes.
Very good.
I think at one time he had shoes, and when we cleaned out his store after he died, there were boxes with like a size 9 and a size 11 in the box. I don't know who bought the other the others. Oh, yeah, it was a real eye opener.
I'll tell you an interesting thing, by the way, is that when I was running Via Hufta in our early years, we were approached by McGregor socks. You guys know McGregor socks?
Oh, yeah, yeah. He
They have
sold
real
those too.
they have really nice socks, you know. And the owner, he said to me, he said, Avrum, we have 1 million single socks. They were basically overruns, or
Right.
you know, they mix up
Or they
socks.
might be from my father's store basement.
Yeah, they might be from your dad's store. And he said, "Do you want them?" And I go, "Yeah, I'll take 1 million single socks, sure."
Sure.
And we took them, you know, in like 10, 15, 20 boxes at a time. And basically what we did was we set up sort
Yeah.
of almost like a marketplace for any organization to come and to take as many socks as they wanted to. And I'll tell you something, I was very proud of that because I saw it as the Kiddush Hashem. Because we had Christian groups coming, we had Muslim groups coming, we had groups of all backgrounds coming and taking socks from us. And they knew that it was from the Jewish community through Via Hafta. And I never hid that, and I never had any intention whatsoever of hiding it. You had a problem with our Jewishness, it's your problem, not ours. I will tell you an interesting story to wrap things up.
I think
And
Anna wants.
what is it, Marion?
I think Anna's got her hand up.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's go to Anna. Anna Bloom?
Okay, I just wanted you to spell Nicholas's last name
Yeah.
again.
So I think
Full-
it's, yes, Winton. W I N is in Nancy. T is in Tom. O N as in Naomi. Winton.
Yeah, I had heard of him before, yeah. Yeah.
Nicholas Winton, you had heard of him. Okay, very
Yeah.
good. So I
Okay.
just want, did you want to say something too, Anna?
No, that's all, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to conclude here with a story on this. Does anybody else want to say anything? Any thoughts, questions, points?
Yeah, I just want to tell you that all these times I wanted to say that we're cousins. My in-laws were Mary and Ben Tully.
So we're mishpacha, you and I?
Yes,
Oh, that's so nice.
your grandmother and my mother-in-law were cousins.
Oh,
And I think your father was at our wedding. I think he was one of the officiating
really?
people that married us.
So we're mishpacha, Marion. Isn't that nice?
Yes.
It was kind of inevitable. Somebody had to be my family here, right? Yeah, okay. All right, family. All right, cousin. Very good. So thanks for sharing. Ellen, you have something to say.
I just want to say there's so much we could still talk about on this subject. And sometimes we live such a sheltered little life that our people, you know, we tend to spend a lot of time with each other. And and I guess anti-Semitism is so loud that we forget that there's a lot of nice people in the world.
Yeah. Social media is making that voice even louder, and you know, it's always the guy or the girl at the front of the line who's got such a big mouth, you know, and they're so vile in nature. They're the ones that are heard, and that's really unfortunate because the truth of the matter is that there are many, many, many fine human beings, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, background, color, doesn't matter. There are fine, fine people out there. And I think we as the Jewish people need to recognize that both for practical reasons and reasons of the world. That we are all, you know, the reason why there's a Rashi at the beginning of the Torah says, why did the Torah begin here, you know, with creation story and then Adam and Eve? Because it's showing that Adam and Eve weren't Jewish, you know. Adam didn't wear a kippah, Eve didn't wear a sheitel. You know, they weren't Jewish, they were just simply God's creations. And nobody can ever say, oh, look, we the Jews were created first, or we the Christians were created first, we the Muslims were created. No, humankind was created first. We are all brothers and sisters at the end of the day. So let me just tell you a story to wrap up here. And thank you, Ellen, thank you very much. There was the Ahafta's van. It goes out on a nightly basis. It has 2 vans now. And it's has anyone ever been on the Viafta van here? So Brian was. Anybody else? Okay. So the Viafta van essentially takes out volunteers into the streets and on a nightly basis helps the homeless, works with the homeless. And it has a social worker on the van and so on. So our driver at the time drove out to City Hall. We used to park the van in various places, City Hall being one of them. And he would open up the van and he would serve food and he would serve drinks, hot drinks in the winter, cold drinks in the summer. We had clothing that we gave off the van. We had books. There's a lot of reading of books in the street. We even gave eyeglasses out at some point. And this fellow, we'll call him Ben. Ben was giving out all this food and the clothing, and he saw someone in the distance watching the van, watching him. Okay. Packed everything up. The next night, same thing. Comes to City Hall, opens up the van, serves people. People come for their sandwiches, they come for their drinks. He sees this fellow in the distance, but a little bit closer this time. This happens a few nights in a row. Finally, after a week, this fellow comes over to Ben and he says, could I have a sandwich and could I have something to drink? And Ben says, of course. And Ben says, so I noticed that you've been watching, for a number of nights. Just curious, like, how come, He says, look, I saw that you are the Jewish fan, and I'm not a big friend of Jews. I don't like the Jewish people. And he says, but after watching you night after night after night, I saw that you had no expectations of anybody, only to feed them and to make them feel good for a little while, if you could. Nothing in return. And I thought, oh, that's not the Jew that I know, and that's not the Jew that I think I know. And he says to Ben, he says, would you mind if I showed you something? Ben said, okay, sure. He says, I'd like to drive you somewhere. So Ben said very courageously, okay. And he wrapped up the night and he drove down together with this fellow to the lake shore. Now, if you know the lake shore, you can drive underneath the lake shore and you see these big rafters, these big pillars. And at the top of the pillars, there's little platforms. So they stopped the van underneath the lake shore. We used to do that a lot. And the fellow gets out and he shows Ben. He says, you see up there? Yeah, I see up there. He says, that's where I live. That's where I sleep. He says, that's where you live and sleep? He goes, yeah, that's my home, up under the expressway. And so Ben looks and he looks a little closer, he sees there's swastikas etched on the walls. So the fellow says to Ben, stay here, give me a second. I said, okay. Fellow goes, set up some sort of ladder to go up this pillar and to get where he lives, where he sleeps. He takes out a can of spray paint and he promptly sets about spraying over the swastikas and erasing the swastikas. And he comes back down and he says to Ben, he says, I would just like to tell you that I'm terribly, terribly sorry for any pain, any suffering that I caused your people. And my views are incredibly different now after watching what you did for those homeless people. So I conclude, take away from this story what you think is important. I would say that we can have an influence on individuals, not on everybody. I'm not naive about that. I know that there are people there who are card carrying, just hateful, hateful individuals, and sometimes there's nothing you can do with them whatsoever. But there are many people who are on the sidelines or sitting on a fence or actually embracing the Jewish people. So be conscious of that. And I would also like to say, Oseh Shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen, that there should be peace in our world. And I would like to extend a great amount of appreciation to those non-Jews who were helpful in rescuing our people, our family, like Ruth Shapiro's mom. I want to extend a thank you to them on behalf of us. Just send that energy out into the world. Somehow, perhaps, they will hear it or their children will hear it or feel it or what have you, because we have to be grateful for everything that people do for us. And we should always be peace amongst our people. We should always be safe. And I hope that you have a beautiful week and a beautiful Shabbat. And thank you so much. Thank you.
No, Avram, thank you so much. I think we could probably just keep talking and listening to you talk and having this discussion we could just go on and on and on and on and on, and it's too bad we can't. But thank you again. On behalf of all of us, thank you
You're
for your words and your stories and your wisdom. And yeah, and we'll see everybody next week. And that's all I have to say is thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm so glad we had this time together.
Yes.
Remember that? Here, hang on a second.
Yeah, I was just gonna do that.
Okay, Lila
Bye.
Tov, I'm off to watch
Lila
the
Tov,
American
thank you.
elections. Lila Tov.
Oh,
Bye.
yeah, me too.
Okay,
Okay,
bye. Bye.
good night.